Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today for this side event on achieving transformative climate action through gender-responsive, rights-based economic challenges, or economic approaches. There are challenges too. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about. So my name is Ben Schachter. I coordinate the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It's my privilege to facilitate today's discussion. This side event is co-organized by UN Human Rights, or OHCHR, and UN University, UN Women, a large number of other UN co-sponsors, all under the umbrella of the UN Environmental Management Group, Issue Management Group on Human Rights and Environment, which brings together over 50 UN specialized agencies and programs working on environmental issues to talk about how to advance the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and human rights-based approaches to environmental action. In today's discussion, we are planning to talk about climate finance, about human rights safeguards and the rules for Article 6, the Just Transition Work Program, and the role of capacity building. You'll hear from a number of distinguished panelists. Before we kick things off with our panel, I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Miss Anita Montot. Apologies on the pronunciations. I may mangle a few. You'll have to forgive me. The Permanent Secretary and with the Ministry of Education and Sustainable Development, Innovation, Science, Technology, and Vocational Training from St. Lucia. And we'll get things started with your remarks. Thank you so much for joining us, Permanent Secretary.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, I bring you warm greetings from the island of St. Lucia. It is an honor to join you today in this very important and timely side event on rights-based climate action, which St. Lucia fully endorses. Climate change represents the greatest threat to the full exercise of human rights today. Global warming, resulting in extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, soil erosion, and sea level rise have a devastating effect on our planet, but most importantly, on the human rights of people. The impacts of climate change seriously compromise our well-being and disproportionately affect those who are most vulnerable, including women, indigenous people, children, youth, migrants, persons with disability, coastal communities, and lower income groups. In St. Lucia, we know it well. As a small island developing state, sorry about that. We know it well as a small island developing state, lying precisely in the front line of climate change and experiencing such impacts firsthand. Our country is a small emitter of greenhouse gases, but is extremely vulnerable to external shocks and climatic events that swipe decades of progress and development gains. We are also facing significant capacity constraints, narrow fiscal space, high public debt, and insufficient resources to respond adequately to climate change. This has been compounded by the lingering effects of COVID-19 pandemic and continuing developmental challenges, which as a small nation, due to our size, geography, limited capacity, and heavy dependence on our economy and environment makes our survival even more onerous. Hence, our urge for bold, collaborative, and people-centered climate action here at COP29 and beyond. St. Lucia recognizes that human rights are essential for the economic growth, social cohesion, environmental stewardship, and sustainable development. They set the foundation for sustainability and are critical to address climate change. Our plans to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius need to put people at the heart, and St. Lucia is doing its part. As a party to the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and to major international human rights instruments, St. Lucia is actively engaged in ensuring transformative, informed, and participatory climate action. St. Lucia has updated its NDC in 2021, which sets the conditional target of reducing GHG gases emission by 16% by 2025, with an indicative reduction of 23% by 2030, focusing on energy demand, electricity generation, and transport, and doing so by mainstreaming gender and meaningfully engaging in all sectors of society, particularly vulnerable groups, children, and the youth. We are also updating our NDC for 2025 with even more ambitious targets. In addition to our country's has adopted its National Adaptation Plan, the NAP, outlining priority cross-sectorial and sectorial adaptation measures for 8 key sectors such as tourism, water, agriculture and fisheries, infrastructure and spatial planning, natural resource management, education and health, focusing on the vulnerable groups. Most recently, the country has enacted the Climate Change Act, number 3 of 2024, to implement the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and the Kyoto Protocol, and institutionalize climate action. The Act recognizes the challenges that climate change poses on our population and develops a comprehensive approach to climate change in addressing mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage for and with our people. The National Climate Change Committee, institutionalized by the law, is a testament to that regard, engaging interested stakeholders from top climate change priority sectors in the development of our climate change priorities and policies, including industries, insurance companies, banks, CSOs, and the youth. Furthermore, St. Lucia is a party to the ESCAZO Agreement on access to environmental information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters since 2021, which guides all environmental policies, including that on climate change. This treaty, the first of the Latin America and the Caribbean on environmental issues, explicitly recognizes the right to a healthy environment and places equality at the center, focusing on protection of the most marginalized and excluded. It is also a powerful tool to enhance climate governance, fostering climate transparency, data and information, and seeking climate justice while protecting those that act in the defense of the environment. But to fully and effectively deliver our ambitious climate commitment, we require global and regional cooperation, financial support, and putting the most vulnerable at the core. In this so-called finance COP, we must redouble people-centered and human rights-based climate investment. The operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund is absolutely critical in that regard, as St. Lucia has emphasized repeatedly, providing financial assistance to the vulnerable communities such as SIDS for loss and damages resulting from climate change impacts that cannot be mitigated or adapted to. This also applies to Article 6.4, International Carbon Crediting Mechanism, and to the Just Transition Work Program. Ladies and gentlemen, the time to act is now. St. Lucia has the fastest woman in the world, Paris Olympic gold medalist Julian Alfred, and as a country has decided to jumpstart and stay ahead of the race against climate change. We are one of the states that has joined Vanuatu and the global community in seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on the obligation of the states under international law and the legal consequences for seeds and the persons of the future generation, where significant harm has been caused due to climate change this December. As a vulnerable nation, we are accelerating our path towards climate resilience, integrating economic and social concerns into climate change, and working with our people, stakeholders from at every level to anticipate and respond to the growing threats of climate change. Additionally, we are on the brink of putting our national implementation plan for the ESCAZO agreement in action to ensure we attain full realization of our SDG goals 2040 agenda. We cannot wait. Our countries must not only bounce back, but strive in the face of these challenges. With everyone's effort, it will be possible. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Permanent Secretary, for kicking us off and for the tremendous work that St. Lucia is doing to advance human rights-based climate action and the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. You also referenced the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. I think we're all anticipating eagerly the hearings in December, and that we need to be fast. And that's absolutely right. And part of being fast means mobilizing resources and doing it quickly and effectively and equitably. And a human rights-based approach is absolutely critical to that. I'm very excited to invite our next speaker for opening remarks, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, to share a little bit and help further set the stage. I do want to reference the time. We don't have too much time to hear from everybody, so just a reminder to all of the speakers today to try to limit your remarks to 5 minutes, so we have time for question and answer. Elisa, go ahead.
I'll keep some short remarks just to reflect a little bit to get us started on finance, Article 6, and just transition. And just really to emphasize the importance of placing center stage, I think, in decisions here and at the national level, all the evidence that UN human rights bodies and experts have collected, particularly in the last 2-3 years, about the disproportionate impact of climate change and of some climate change measures on human rights holders, with particular reference also to differentiated impacts for women and girls, persons with disabilities, older persons who are already facing racial discrimination, and those that find themselves in situations leading to their displacement, and many other grounds, I think, that make the impacts of climate change not only differentiated and disproportional, but really compounding other critical challenges for the protection of those in situations that are most vulnerable to climate change. Now, all the body of evidence and all the standards that have been clarified in interpreting and applying human rights in the context of climate change, those are essential to really, I think, have a clearer sense of the obligation to prevent further negative impacts, which are fully foreseeable now and preventable in the context of the decisions that are taken here and the action that's taken at the national level. And so what that means for finance, for instance, is that the amount of international finance we need must be proportional to the need to prevent foreseeable negative impacts on human rights, and particularly those disproportionate impacts on the human rights holders that find themselves in most vulnerable situations. And equally, we need that finance to be accessible directly to those human rights holders who have faced the brunt of climate change, because it is their lived experiences, their understanding of climate change and how to protect their human rights that really provides the most direct and, I think, reliable basis for choosing effective climate action. And as was already mentioned by the keynote speaker, we need also to look into climate finance that does not increases debt, and in fact shifts attention and implementation of the polluter pays principle. In the context of Article 6, again, the scientific evidence around already existing negative human rights impacts of some of the carbon markets that have been created, but also I think the lack of a reliable body of science showing the carbon markets are delivering on climate mitigation, I think is essential in that framing the essential safeguards to make sure that this instrument doesn't actually not only not help in terms of climate action, but also lead to further predictable violations of human rights. And that's the case particularly of Indigenous peoples' human rights, but in fact, wherever there is fraud, which has been increasingly documented, and other evidence of ineffective action as part of climate carbon markets, it's really undermining everyone's human right to a healthy environment, and particularly children's and girls' human right to a healthy environment. And again, for the negotiations on just transition, we need to use this body of evidence to really understand holistically what measures we need across mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. We cannot afford not to learn as much as possible from what has been suffered and experienced by those that have borne the brunt of climate change, and really use then that more holistic vision, which I think is sometimes hard to find at the climate COP because of all the different agenda items, to really think more systemically about the need to protect the most vulnerable, and through that lens, really identifying and prioritizing the most effective climate action that can provide that effective protection, and really learning from the lived experiences of those who have been affected, and maybe what may be still surprising human rights impacts that we have identified in the last few years, particularly for women and girls, negative impacts on the right to education, on their health, but also increased gender violence linked to climate change and to climate-induced human mobility, as well as more exposure to human trafficking and to modern forms of slavery. All of the evidence needs to be at the center of all the decisions that are taken here to make sure that this is more effective climate action in general to everyone's benefit, but to prevent those foreseeable negative impacts for specific human rights holders who have provide that essential evidence to all of us for better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think you've wonderfully framed the ground we have to cover. And I want to get right to our panelists, starting with Rabeb Aloui, who's here representing Yango and a leading youth voice advocating for the integration of human rights and gender equality and climate action. We'd love to hear from you about how youth are approaching this issue, the role that youths can play, and what actions or policies you're advocating for to make sure that funding supports people, and particularly those in disadvantaged situations. Over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Hello, everyone. I'm Rabeb Aloui from Tunisia, and today I'm representing Yango. Allow me to start my speech today. I would love to share with you some statistics, some important statistics for me. We have over the globe in the world, 65 million young people are unemployed today. In Tunisia, for example, my country, in some region, the unemployment among young people is over 30%, and sometimes in some region, 40 and 50%. In the MENA region, we have around 25% of unemployment among young people. With young people, we have women who work in several sectors. In agriculture, for example, women around the globe represent 43% of the agricultural workforce, but they don't own the land. They are exploited. They are not paid equally like men. At the same time, I would love to share with you this important statistic also, because weather-led disasters led to 43.1 million displacement of children over 6 years. Why I started with these statistics to show you that always and still today, women, young people, indigenous people are among the most vulnerable, especially when it comes to economy and when it comes to climate change. I shared with you these statistics to show you how much young people and women are impacted by climate change and by this economic situation, and also to give you a message of hope, because I think today the role that young people and women can play to enhance and to live in a better world is still there. Young people can bring solutions, can be the alternatives, can give ideas to many issues, especially when it comes to finance and climate change action. And for me, it's important today to respond to your question now, to involve young people when it comes to decision making and in finance. I think I started, and not I think, I started my speech talking about employment among young people. Because for me, if we rely on the workforce of young people and women, the world would be better. The world would be open to all different young people from all over the world. I'm talking about young people and women and also indigenous people. And we will find a solution to this in employment and the climate change issue. So when it comes to finance, I think it's important to include projects and to have more finance for young people and for women for a better world, as I said from the beginning. For me, when it comes to finance, also it's important to adopt human rights strategies so that people living in fragile and vulnerable communities are prioritized. And that's why I talked about displaced people, because human mobility is a reality today. And for me, it's important, as we are here in COP, I will take advantage of me being at COP in this session today to call for more recognition about climate migration and human mobility. And as we have a negotiation track, I'm personally following adaptation. It's important, and this is a message for you. It's important to include climate mobility as an adaptation strategy. I'm seeing a lot of potential in young people, and especially in young migrants and women. So it's important today to talk about human mobility, to talk about climate migration as an adaptation strategy. And again, young people have potential, have the solution. The young people and women are the alternatives. And if we are talking about the impact of climate change today, let's think about these young people. Let's think about women. Let's think about indigenous people. Let's include them when it comes to projects, when it comes to finance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And absolutely critical that we have finance that is human rights based, gender responsive, disability and age inclusive, among other things. And I think that discussion is one of the really important discussions taking place here and even earlier this morning at COP29. And we're counting on all of you here to either speak with your delegations if you're here on behalf of a state, or reach out to states that you know to ensure that the new collective quantified goal on finance does reflect states' human rights obligations. Our next speaker is Mary Joyce Crisanto, who is the director of the Human Rights Policy Center's Office for the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. She has a wealth of experience in advancing human rights, particularly in the context of environmental justice and climate resilience. We've asked her to reflect and share a little bit about how, based on her experience, climate finance can play a role in ensuring human rights are upheld in climate adaptation and resilience efforts, as well as with regard to loss and damage, and what a COP29 outcome that could ensure funds reach the people who need it most would look like, both in terms of process and outcome. And I've added a last-minute request as well that she shared just a little bit about the work that the Philippines National Human Rights Commission has done on the responsibilities of businesses with respect to the climate crisis. So over to you. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you. Okay, just before I proceed to the first part, let me just give you a brief introduction on the national inquiry that the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines conducted. It was launched the report was launched in May 2022, but it was the outcome of a petition filed by the Greenpeace in 2015. So you can imagine the span of 7 years that it took from the preliminary to the final release of the report. The report is available on the official website of the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. It was a petition filed by 32 petitioners composed of 14 NGOs and CSOs and 18 individuals. And the conduct was both national, and we also went to New York to listen to scientific experts. The report finds that climate change is real. The Commission accepts the unequivocal truth as established by peer-reviewed science that climate change is real and happening on a global scale. Number two, climate change is a grave and urgent human rights concern. The report illustrates how a whole gamut of human rights is impacted by climate change and has prevented many Filipinos, and perhaps in other parts of the world as well, from living their lives with dignity. And number three, business enterprises are responsible for respecting human rights, including in the context of climate change. The National Inquiry on Climate Change report illustrates in detail how the following rights of the people are affected: the rights to life, health, food security, future generations and intergenerational equity, water and sanitation, safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, adequate housing, preservation of culture, self-determination, and development. And this is why climate finance is not simply a matter of resource allocation. It is a transformative agent, but only truly if it puts human rights front and center. First, climate finance must be understood as a tool for promoting human rights, especially of the vulnerable communities who are often the least responsible for climate change, yet they experience its harshest consequences. For them, adaptation is not an abstract concept, it is the difference between survival and catastrophe. Climate finance must prioritize their needs, directing resources to build resilience and enhance adaptive capacity in ways that respect, protect, and promote their fundamental human rights to life, health, food, water, housing, and self-determination. Climate finance spending must be accompanied by human rights due diligence that looks into how projects will impact those rights. And the findings of such human rights due diligence must be made accessible to all stakeholders. Transparency and accountability must be embedded in every aspect of climate finance. It is saddening to note that the countries where climate funds are most needed are also those countries where these funds have the highest rate of loss due to bureaucratic inefficiencies, or worse, to corruption, leaving intended beneficiaries with empty promises. The COP must commit to creating a robust oversight mechanism that tracks how funds are allocated, used, and monitored. Importantly, these mechanisms should include representatives from the affected communities, ensuring their voices guide and shape how resources are spent. This participatory approach not only respects their right to be heard, but also strengthens the effectiveness and sustainability of climate solutions. It also provides a check and balance mechanism in climate fund management. Meaningful participation extends beyond oversight. Vulnerable communities, the indigenous peoples, women, children, people with disability, and the elderly are not passive recipients of aid. They are experts in their own right with invaluable knowledge and lived experience. We must embrace a rights-based approach that ensures that these affected populations are involved at every stage, from project design and planning to implementation and evaluation. This is not merely about consultation. It is about empowerment and true partnership. Climate finance must also address the structural inequalities that drive vulnerability. Investments should target social and economic equity by building infrastructure that is climate resilient, strengthening social safety nets, and improving access to essential services such as healthcare, education, and justice systems. By doing so, climate finance can help dismantle the root causes of marginalization and enable communities not only to adapt to climate change, but also to be contributors to mitigation. Funding efforts should be measured not just by dollar amounts spent, but more importantly, by tangible improvements in people's lives. On the matter of loss and damage, we recognize that for many communities, adaptation alone is not enough. The damage has been done to them, whether it is the loss of lives, livelihoods, homes, or cultural heritage. These losses must be addressed through fair and timely reparative finance. COP must advance mechanisms that provide new and additional funding streams dedicated to loss and damage that should be accessible without creating further debt burdens. Accessibility requires the need to let go of the obsession for paperwork and paper trail, which becomes exclusionary for the most vulnerable and the most in need. This is where collaboration with civil society groups and community leaders can play a vital role in ensuring that funds directly benefit those with the most urgent and greatest need. These may sound all too familiar and basic, but it is often the most obvious that we are blinded to. COP29 offers a critical approach to unleash the transformative potential of climate finance by prioritizing transparency, accountability, participation, equity, and reparative mechanisms in this peculiar fiscal management system. To do so, not only the states are called upon, but also the businesses, civil society, and even the affected communities to this challenge. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po.
You so much, Joyce, and I asked in particular for that extra bit on the inquiry because a lot of the controversial. Sorry, I think I'm just too far away. A lot of the challenging aspects of the discussion of the NCQG relate to issues around investment and to what extent the private sector could or should be a contributor to the new collective quantified goal on finance. And the reality is that under human rights law, states have the obligation to mobilize finance to protect people from the impacts of climate change and to remedy those impacts. And if businesses are part of that picture, it's also really important to note, as Joyce shared, businesses have human rights responsibilities. And so we shouldn't be talking about their contributions in terms of nice things they might do, but we should be talking about their potential contributions in terms of accountability for the harms that have been perpetuated by business contributions to climate change over decades. So I think that that concludes the portion of our panel focusing on the finance specifically. We're going to move on to hear from a couple of panelists about Article 6, and then a couple more about just transition. And I hope we have sufficient time for a discussion following that. So our next speaker is Janine Yazzie. She is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, has over 14 years of experience as a community organizer and human rights advocate, working on the intersections of climate change, water security, food security, energy development, and nation building with Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led organizations in the US, Canada, and Latin America. And Janine, we look forward to hearing from you about the risks and impacts of carbon markets on the rights of Indigenous peoples and your ideas about how to ensure that decisions taken at COP29 related to carbon markets respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today and to speak on behalf of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, who's been following these negotiations very diligently for the past several COPs. And I think that for this COP, one of the things that raises the alarm for us is just really the actions by the supervisory bodies and their procedural handling, particularly of the two key standards around methodology requirements and activities involving removals, because we're rushing through a decision that completely doesn't respond to the call for the need for robust safeguards for human rights and for Indigenous peoples' rights. And Indigenous peoples are often on the front lines of many of these battles. I mean, we've been advocating for stricter standards and for higher aspirations when it comes to addressing the climate crisis, but we've also been raising the alarm on how many of our approaches to climate change solutions need to have a rights-based framework in order for it to truly benefit not just Indigenous peoples, but all peoples who have been systemically oppressed or exploited by the very systems that have contributed the most to climate change. And in doing that, ensuring that we also have pathways to contribute our solutions so that we're not continuing to promote false solutions as is being proposed by the entire carbon market trade system, which study after study has shown it has been a failure. And we're now seeing the pressures of even recognizing and this past year learning that natural carbon sinks themselves can't keep up with the rates of emissions that we are dealing with. And so the need for safeguards is vital. And it's not something that will only benefit Indigenous peoples, but also benefits all of our peoples, all of our ecosystems, and our Mother Earth. And so we continue to hold the line in negotiations here and putting forward recommendations that not only call for parties to ensure that there are strong commitments to upholding and incorporating the rights of Indigenous peoples in our agreements, but also incorporating robust safeguards for all peoples, which include human rights safeguards, and maintaining CMA oversight in the processes, the procedural processes. These are all things that we must continue to push for because Indigenous peoples' lands are the lands that are being targeted when it comes to so-called carbon capture projects. And the market schemes that are in place are allowing for the perpetuation of harmful projects in other Indigenous territories. And so being in global spaces like this to work with Indigenous peoples across the globe, we're able to bring these lived experiences and the realities of these threats to climate change negotiations, but to also all of civil society and all UN bodies so that we can make more informed decisions for the benefit of all peoples, because we shouldn't be put into a position where we're trading rights for one community and benefits for one community to the detriment of another. These are not solutions that are going to bring us toward, help us make progress towards meeting our climate goals. And they're not solutions that will help us and ensure that we are investing in the proper alternatives that actually effectively address some of our biggest challenges when it comes to climate change and some of our biggest needs when it comes to reducing our emissions effectively and completely. And so for Indigenous peoples like us, we don't have time to waste. We're out of time for meaningful action. We are already seeing the devastating impacts in our communities. And to see those impacts compounded by the investments into false solutions that aren't helping us restore everything that is currently being destroyed or has been destroyed, it's devastating. We really need effective climate action now. And we know that advocating and ensuring that safeguards are implemented in all aspects of negotiations around Article 6 is a start to put us on the right path to do that effectively.
Thank you very much, Janine. And we'll continue immediately, I think, in the interest of time, to Rebecca Eworks from NAMADI. NAMADI is an organization dedicated to legal empowerment and strengthening the rule of law in environmental governance. So Rebecca's work focuses on ensuring that human rights and environmental justice are essential to the implementation of carbon markets, particularly within the Article 6.4 framework. So if you could share with us your reflections and thoughts about how human rights obligations of states and responsibilities of businesses should be addressed in the context of carbon markets, and how to ensure that these discussions on Article 6 here help us do that?
In 5 minutes. My name is Rebecca, and Namati, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is a justice organization. So we focus on using legal empowerment to help justice seekers know, use, and shape the law. We work in 6 countries, and then we host the Grassroots Justice Network that has about 16,000 individuals in it that are different frontline justice seekers. And the reason why we're here talking about carbon markets is because our network members have found themselves in the middle of carbon markets. And I mean that quite literally. The land where they've lived and worked for generations suddenly has become part of this conversation about a carbon market. And so whether that's they find that someone comes into their community as a carbon cowboy with a suitcase full of cash and says, hey, there's something that we could do here, or they find out from some other way that somebody else is already financially benefiting from the land where they're living. And so this is how we started the conversation. These are justice issues that are happening on the ground. And those are the issues we're also interested in trying to address in how then what ends up in the language in Article 6 and other global frameworks. For those of you who don't follow carbon markets in detail, what happened last night was that in the plenary session, they decided to approve all of the work that the supervisory body has on Article 6.4 has done over the last year without any debate. There are all sorts of procedural problems with that, and as the last speaker alluded to, but we also think there are some substantive problems to that. So there were 2 really important documents that were approved. One of them is a grievance mechanism, and the other is a sustainable development tool. Both of those are supposed to be some of those safeguards for Article 6.4, which is this voluntary carbon market under the UN. Unfortunately, there are still big gaps in both of those documents in terms of really being able to protect human rights of the people who are impacted by these projects. The biggest gap that we see is around land rights. Right now, the only land rights that are protected in the Sustainable Development Tool are twofold. One, there's pretty good, but not perfect protection of a recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights and the need for free, prior, and informed consent throughout the life cycle of a project, at the beginning, the middle, during the whole project, which is a necessary starting point. Second is a protection or a recognition of challenges related to reprisals. What's missing in there is the way that the other land rights start is a conversation of if people are dispossessed from their land, the way that they should be compensated. It doesn't start with a recognition of understanding who has different types of tenure rights to that land, or understanding how those tenure rights are negotiated for access to that carbon rights, what types of benefit sharing agreements there is. And the real concern we see about that is if you don't start with that as part of your conversation, then who's identified as stakeholders and who has the authority to be part of these conversations, or to address the grievance mechanism in the future, is going to be a big challenge. And we know that land-based problems are one of the biggest human rights problems that happens related to carbon markets. And so missing the opportunity to include good tenure security recognition in Article 6 is a challenge. There's still an opportunity over the next 2 weeks to have guidance that recognizes that. And if that isn't in the guidance over the next 2 weeks, then there's opportunities to revise the Sustainable Development Tool over time. So keep watching. The other thing I would ask you all to keep watching about is about the way that environmental rights defenders are protected throughout carbon markets. So I'm sure the folks who choose to come to this room are familiar with a lot of the challenges related to environmental rights protectors writ large. It's true in carbon markets as well. And there is some language that recognizes the challenges related to retaliations. What we need across carbon markets is a zero tolerance policy. If there is any retaliation to anyone who is trying to speak up about a project, then the project shouldn't continue. It should stop. And that should be the responsibility of both the government and the private sector to make sure that that happens. So if a national government isn't doing that, the folks who buy carbon credits should have that same expectation, because they don't want these projects. They're buying these credits in part to better their social general social license to operate, they don't want to see people harmed by that. There is an opportunity to make that argument with the private sector that's a little bit different than in some other business and human rights spaces. And the last thing I'll leave you with today is what we anticipate is going to happen next, now that Article 6.4 is passed, is a proliferation of national governments writing legislation about what carbon policy will look like in their countries. And that is another opportunity or challenge where we can either really protect human rights and make sure that land rights as they are currently defined within nations, or even stronger land rights, are defined in those national carbon policies, and who is going to have the right to benefit from the carbon that is traded within different countries is really protected in those national legislation, or the opposite, as we're seeing in some places, where the government holds all of that control and then communities aren't necessarily part of those conversations. And so it's another good space to be able to influence over the next year.
Thank you. And if I can editorialize for a moment, I think that there are a number of really important concerns raised by both of our speakers on Article 6, and not the least of which is the question of whether or not it actually contributes to emission reductions in any way, shape, or form at all. Right, and I think that the evidence and analysis that's been done to date has shown that the lack of effective regulation and safeguards has resulted in essentially a wild West-style frontier of carbon markets credits that don't reflect actual emission reductions. And then you've heard, in addition to this problem, that human rights violations are often perpetuated in the context of carbon market credit creation processes, whatever we would call them, and that the Article 6.4 standards were adopted yesterday following irregular procedure, which Tuvalu objected to or expressed their concern about in the plenary, which in fact involves the supervisory body on Article 6.4, which is a group of 25 experts developing standards, but then no discussion of those standards by the Conference of the Parties. So a lot to continue to unpack and explore further here. But I will move on for the moment to our next speaker, who is Ms. Gina Cortez. She'll be speaking about just transition. She's the co-focal point of the UNFCCC Women and Gender Constituency, a Colombian activist and a good friend of UN human rights and the work that we do. Gina, we're very happy to have you here with us and would like to invite you to share your thoughts on how the Just Transition work program can support an equitable and just transition to a sustainable economy that benefits all people and the environment.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Buen día para todos. And I will try it as well while talking to make the connections of just transition, gender responsive, but also on the economic approaches, because I think that sometimes we forget the context and the geopolitical context in which we are living. We are talking about just transitions, but I would like us to reflect on what a just transition means for Palestine, what a just transition means for Lebanon, or what a just transition means for Sudan. I think the just transition discussions that are happening here are not fitting really the reality that it goes outside the facilities of this place. So when we are really talking honestly in these conversations about the just transitions that we want to see, we want to get out a little bit of that narrative that is just fueling a corporate and energy transition that is fulfilling the reproduction of capital. And that is actually as well based on see how we find solutions within an economic system that is rotten. An economic system that is based on the biggest and continuous historical subsidy, which is the unpaid, unvalued, and unrecognized care and domestic work that is done by women and gender non-conforming people throughout the world. Because the work that they do is what facilitates and enables other ways of work. And because that work at the same time is what enables and what is being used, exploited, plundered for fulfilling the fossil fuel and military-based economies. And we are not bringing that discussions. And this is truly, truly not just a women's matter. This is not just a women's matter that some girls need to be speaking about. This is something that is the basis of the capitalist system as it is run today. And we have assumed that the economic system, the economic model that is running our societies today is just perfect. That is okay. But that economic system is now fueling genocides. So it is not correct. It is an economic system that was based perhaps when many countries were still colonized, when many institutions were shaped while countries were colonized, and where we see as well the big undemocratic power that some countries have in such institutions that we are now asking them to be part of the just transitions, to be funding losses and damage. So there is a big incoherence there, because then in that way, we are not going to be responding and making the guarantees that are needed for a human rights centered approach. And in this economic system or the discussions that we're having in these negotiation rooms, when we talk about gender responsive in the just transition, it is not about how we are going to include women into that rotten system. We need to open that discussion to other conversations, because what is happening now in the negotiation rooms is that when talking about international cooperation is now being seen and how we are going to repeat and replicate the cycles of dependency in which countries from the global south keep on being extracted to fulfill that renewable energy transition, the greening of a capitalist model. So when we are talking about international cooperation, is not how we are going to be perpetuating those relationships of unequal exchange. And by an equal exchange, what do I mean? I mean that in that exercise of unfair trade agreements where the South have been plundered, have been extracted not only their resources, because we tend to think about the materiality of stuff, right? So the natural resource is not about only the raw materials that they are taking us, but the energy that is needed for extracting those raw materials, the labor that is being used for extracting those raw materials, and the time of the people to extract those materials. All of those different resources that are local resources, let's say, that are being used to be exported, to be extracted out for the luxury and the comfort of some countries in the north. While actually that and the terrain of land, while actually that land, that energy, that labor, that time should be used for having a regional discussion, having a discussion on how do we want to develop? What is the transition that we are aiming for? What is what we need? And countries like, for example, where I come from in Colombia, in Latin America, we are not lacking imagination. We are not lacking imagination on the solutions. There are all the kind of solutions. But what happens is that we are chained to cycles of illegitimate debt that are being continued in the negotiations on finance. We are chained to what the North has been planning for us. What we see that is happening with the European Green Deal, what we see that is happening with the US Green Deals. They are having a plan for the South to keep on greening now the consumption and production patterns, but know how human rights are going to be guaranteed. And that is what we need to be challenging as well in those conversations, how we are moving as well apart from that. So that is also something that I would like to address, and also to invite us when we come to these spaces? How are we expanding our notion and understanding of gender, of human rights, of economic justice? And for that, also conscious of time, I will invite them, all of you, to truly follow the work that feminists have been doing, because we as feminists are really drawing the connections from economic justice, from tax justice, from what that has to do as well when we're calling for reparations, when we're calling for truly just transitions that are not just the reproduction of capital, but the guarantees for a life in dignity. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Gina, and really appreciate the energy and the afternoon here after lunch. Our next speaker is Ambe Emmanuel Cheo. He's the Vice Rectorate in Europe for United Nations University, and works on advancing capacity and building initiatives for sustainable development, including just transition. Emmanuel, we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on how capacity building can help drive a just transition and broader transformation toward sustainability. I think it was great, Gina, how you connected just transition with all of the other elements we've been discussing here today, and the broader questions of entrenched discrimination, colonialism, etc. And how do we get past that? One of the things we need is better capacity building and support to people who are working every day to try to address climate change. So if you could share with us some examples as well, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmanuel Cheo, and I represent the United Nations University, the Vice Rectorate in Europe. We are based in Bonn, Germany. And maybe before I answer the question, I would like to talk a little bit about the United Nations University and the role we play in supporting capacity building. It is a think tank and the academic arm of the UN system, which was established in 1972 by the General Assembly to serve the UN system, the member states, and its people. In a broader context, our work, our topic that we address is around human survival, human development, and human welfare. As a UN university, we conduct research, we conduct graduate education programs, and also long degree training, as well as specialized training programs for our partners, the member states, and other UN agencies. Back to the question, when we talk about capacity building is a critical means of implementation for addressing the UNFCCC goal, particularly towards transitioning away from fossil fuel, or on the topic that we are discussing today on transformation. And if we broadly categorize means of transportation, this could be broadly categorized as climate finance, technology transfer, and last but not the least, capacity building, which means that member states are in need of a series of capacity to address their different challenges, and also in implementing other targets such as National Adaptation Plan, NDC, or Just Transition, as we heard. Article 2 of the Paris Agreement also highlights the need of capacity building and also the need of a collective action through partnership to support particularly developing countries in addressing capacity building gaps and need. And key principles of capacity building are it should be country driven. It should foster a more it should foster I've forgotten the word, sorry for that. It should be built on lesson learned as well as gender responsive driven. And it is also an important element in the negotiation because I'm really sorry about this. So there are different levels of capacity building, if I may put it this way. And we have the individual capacity building, we have the systemic capacity building, as well as the institutional capacity building. So far, what has been achieved or what is often being conducted is the individual capacity building. So, and what has been observed so far now is that countries are driving towards institutional capacity building, which means that they want to retain capacity and also be able to transfer this capacity building to future generation or in other institutions in their respective country. So when we talk about just transition or transformation towards sustainable towards sustainability, capacity building is still a major gap in most developing countries, particularly at the institutional level, signaling the effort so far is inadequate, insufficient, and thus further this inequality that exists in climate change that we discuss most often. So this definitely needs to define a new approach in the way we conduct capacity building. And it is for this reason that in our project called Input South, which is funded by IDRC, a Canadian agency, we are building capacity of institutions, which are universities, NGO, civil societies, to be able to drive just energy transition in their respective countries. And these are 10 different countries that we are working on, with the aim that these institutions are going to drive the needed capacity in the respective countries to strengthen the institutions that are responsible for just energy transition. We will be organizing an event tomorrow, so I invite you who are here to attend, which will focus more on gender-based transition, just energy transition that you mentioned. And this also will be explaining the need of how climate finance support this just transition, as well as the role of capacity building in supporting just energy transition, as well as a transformation towards sustainability. And maybe to conclude, I would say creating the enabler environment by ensuring a national capacity can empower developing countries to lead their own transition and transformation according to their unique context, because context is very important, and also under the guidance of their national leadership. In this sense, education, training, reskilling, upskilling should be prioritized. Women and underrepresented group should be empowered, and collaboration between industries, civil societies, policymakers, and other stakeholders should be encouraged. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to all of our panelists. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So if there's anybody who would like to ask a question or comment, please go ahead and raise your hands. There are a couple of wireless mics, and we can get one of those to you. So questions, comments? Somebody want to break the ice? Okay, there you go. Thanks very much.
So thank you to all of the panelists for really an enlightening relations, talking about really sensitive issues about the connection between some kind like technical issues as defining and regulating not only climate but also energy markets, but also dealing with the engagement of people, because when we talk about sustainability, actually we're talking about of sustainability for people, not essentially for something that is abstract and so far away from people. So just maybe it's a dumb question or just a curiosity. I would like to ask to the panelists if you have some like insights to share about some also engagement of women, practical engagement of women in also achieving these goals, and not just maybe asking for finance that it's at least, well, it's important also, but at the moment, if you have also some testimonials of good actions, also from the perspective of women, groups of women in tackling these issues, and of course also indigenous women when we talk about carbon markets and climate actions itself. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could ask you to introduce yourself, I should have earlier, but just quickly. And please, folks, some other questions, comments would be great. And then I'll come back to our panel for like 1 minute concluding thoughts. And then we've got an excellent closing speaker with us as well. So that's the rest of the agenda. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Emanuela Rasso. I'm representing here ELSA, the European Law Students Association. I'm the member also of the Yango constituency. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have another hand here in the front row. Anybody else get in the queue, please?
My name is Maria Jose Lubertino from Buenos Aires University. I'm teaching human rights. I am a human rights professor, and also I am here as member of the Latin American and Caribbean Ecofeminist Network. I think that you have put the main human rights agenda for the next 10 years in this presentation. Thank you for that. But I want to know how we could put together all our incomes and our resources in this difficult moment for the world, where many of the human rights institutions in the United Nations system and also in the Latin American system, in our case, are not well financed because the states are keeping the money away with many change in some governments, and how we put together our resources, not only once a year when we come together to the COPs, but in the long-term work, empowering civil society with human rights and trying to do work better the system.
Thank you, Maria Jose. I'm looking for any further comments, questions, reflections. Please don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Colombe from the Atlas Movement. I have a question specifically for Gina on your point about Palestine, about complicity, about how to have a just transition considering the situation right now. So we know Azerbaijan is one of the main suppliers of fossil fuels to Israel. We know, along with the US, it's enabling the genocide, etc. We also know that it's stopping a lot of conversations around how to actually stand with Palestine at this very conference, and that it's very difficult to talk about genocide here and about what the UN should be doing about it, about how to put it on top of the political agenda. So beyond campaigning in our individual countries to turn off the tap and to support Palestine, etc., what do you recommend activists, observers, parties do here today, considering the political restrictions in Azerbaijan at this very COP, and the fact that so many countries are refusing to put Palestine on top of the agenda? That's all. Sorry.
Thank you. And I had another hand here.
Hi everyone, I'm Genevieve Gabriel. I am from the Philippines. I'm also part of Young from International Federation of Catholic Parochial Youth Movements. So my question is from the people who talked about climate finance earlier. So I know it has been mentioned that world funds are being pledged for climate action. A significant concern remains that these resources always doesn't always reach those who need them most. So how do you think can we effectively advocate at the national level or push through with our own governments for robust transparency and accountability measures, ensuring that climate funds genuinely reach the most vulnerable communities? Or what frameworks or any policy approaches can drive this accountability, especially in countries where tracking mechanisms may be weak? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions or comments before I return to our panelists? Going once, going twice, back to the panel. So we had a number of questions. One, and I'll come back to you, panelists, in the order we went with in the first place. One question asking to share insights about practical engagement of women in achieving human rights-based climate action, particularly in this context of just transition and finance and Article 6. Another question about how we can work together in challenging political contexts when human rights institutions and movements are not adequately funding, and also how we do that outside of the CUP space, and in essence, build a global and ongoing movement. Another question about the ways that these discussions are linked with Gaza and also with the domestic human rights situation here in Azerbaijan. And a question about how to advocate effectively at the national level to ensure finance reaches local communities. So I'd encourage the panelists to respond to what they would like with respect to these questions. There's no need for everybody to respond to each one, and also to just share any concluding reflections. And you have about 90 seconds to do so. And we will start with Rebov. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I will be quick in my response. For the insight regarding women, I think it's important not only to empower women, but also to include them in decision making, especially when it comes to negotiations. For example, women need to be in the table, need to negotiate. So for me, the most important thing is to involve women and also young people in decision making processes. How can we make a change in national level, I think we need to push and to call for more inclusion of young people, for example, in NAPs and NDCs. Hope it's 20 seconds, right?
That was great, very efficient. And you are next, Joyce.
On the question regarding climate finance, I just have three maybe pointers, reminders. One is demand accountability from our leaders in government. Two, participate actively in public hearings in Congress, lobby with your legislators. And three, build your own capacities, especially for CSOs and community leaders, to directly engage with funders. Because what I said earlier is that a lot of funds are lost to bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption. So we would like to see funds going directly to the beneficiaries, but you need to have the capacity for that. And so if the only takeaway from this afternoon is that one, to be involved, and two, demand transparency and accountability from our leaders, I think I would have sent my message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Janine?
Very shortly, I think the strongest thing I can say is that restoring the sacredness of woman and honoring the sacredness of woman is paramount to us being able to address the issues that come from the structures that are in place. Every developed nation is built off of institutions that promote heteropatriarchy, supremacist culture, and the first and longest colonized race is women, are the feminine. If we're to break free from these chains, it's not only about allowing women and Indigenous women a seat at the table in decision making, but also completely transforming these structures from in the first place. And when you invest in women-led initiatives and solutions to many of the problems that we see, you have that wisdom and those values embedded in everything that they do, because as caretakers of our families and our communities, as cultural barriers for our people, we come with a worldview and a mindset that is rooted in the sacredness of life. And that's ultimately what we need to do to transform the systems and institutions that we are dealing with.
Great. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for the question about how gender integrates into some of these issues, and my apologies for not being more clear about it beforehand as well. We create these silos as we're trying to organize a lot of information in climate spaces, and sometimes that means that we miss what's happening. And I think the way you had just explained it really brings that out. So let me give you a real life example of how gender is related to carbon markets. In Bont, Sierra Leone, it's a really rural community on an island that is surrounded by mangroves. The women in that community make money in two ways. They collect mussels or clams from the mangroves, and then they collect firewood from the mangroves. Now, if there's a carbon that community is now talking with a project developer about starting a carbon project in that community. That will change how those women are allowed. The community will make rules about how people are allowed to interact with the mangroves, including no longer doing the shell fishing and having different rules about when and how and where you can collect firewood. Then the whole community will get money as a result of that project. The women's power in the whole community decision-making is really different than when they sell those shellfish themselves and have that money in their own pocket, right? And so that really changes the whole power dynamic in the community of who has access to money. And also, what are the priorities in the community in that negotiating is really different if you listen to the women in that community than if you listen to the men. And I think that plays out within the community level. One way to deal with that is you have separate conversations among different genders in a community before you bring everyone together to have community organizing and decision making, or along that community organizing process. But I think it really plays out in terms of also what is communicated then at the global level, what stories emerge, what issues are prioritized, because the power dynamics are shifting within communities as these different types of markets come to play.
Thank you. And Gina, over to you.
So I will start by reiterating and inviting all of you to follow the work of the feminist movement of the Women and Gender Constituency. You will find a lot of answers there. For the question on the gender solutions, then I will stand only by saying that I would like to invite you all to the Gender Just Climate Solutions Awards. The Gender Just Climate Solutions Awards ceremony happens every year, and we are exactly doing that, uplifting and bringing and visibilizing those gender-led solutions. This is going to be on the 20th at 3 p.m. at the side event room 9. So you can go there, you can follow the work, and then you will find the publications. You can also follow the publications if you're not going to be there. Follow the publications that are based in the website. And on the second question of Palestine and other genocides, so this is a longer response, let's say, but many different things. On the 15 on Friday, there's going to be the release on an open letter that is written by the COP29 Climate Justice Coalition, a coalition that is endorsed and which many thousands of organizations, including the rights-based constituencies, are part. And in this letter, we are clearly framing our demands, what parties, but also what activists can do. In this moment on the ground, we are organizing, we are mobilizing, and we keep on standing in international solidarity with our comrades and our siblings from Palestine. Something that perhaps I might bring to reflect is how one of the demands of us is to implement mandatory, robust, comparable, and transparent reporting on the military emissions, including those emissions from conflicts that a system that it needs to exist under the UNFCCC framework. There is no system that is measuring the emissions that come from the military. This is not integrated when we are talking about NDCs. This is not integrated when we are talking about those growth-based delirious systems of the GDP. And this is something that we need to be considering. This is just one of them. But of course, we are talking about divestment. We are talking about the funding. We're talking about many other things. So I will invite you all to follow the work of the COP29 Climate Justice Coalition. There will be an open letter extending on that. And on Thursday, we are going to have a manifestation and action where folks from Palestine, folks that are part of the energy embargo, are also going to be connecting the grief, the horror, the sadness with concrete demands to shift the conversation in this narrative. So do join us in these different moments and follow the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thank you very much. With respect to the first question on empowering women organization, in our event tomorrow, we will be having more case studies from our sister institute, the United Nations University based in Ghana, where they will be sharing a project which was focused on just energy transition. But at our end, from the first project or the first phase of the Impulse Out project, what we did was that we identify women project, because I think this should be a voluntary aspect. And through that, we provided them with seed grants and then accompanied them to develop their project into startup, so as to also empower them economically. I think through that, these different groups of women were empowered. That is just one example that we did when it comes to women empowerment and with respect to just transition. With respect to the second question on long-term sustainability, I think putting on my capacity building lens, I think the best way forward is to retain capacity at the national level, which to a certain extent it's missing now, because often what happens is it's a short-term project, or you have a foreign consultant initiative or workshop, which at the end, the capacity is not retained in the country. And that is also what we are emphasizing in our the second phase of our Impulse Out project. And through this project also, we are aiming to create a community of practice for just energy transition, so as to keep people of common interests so that they can share and learn from each other, and also empower each other through such platform, but also promoting this South-South collaboration. So these are my short answer to the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've done quite well on time. We have a final speaker to try to help us wrap things up. Michelle Forst is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Environmental Human Rights Defenders under the Aarhus Convention. And I think it's quite appropriate that we close with your reflections, Michelle, particularly given that we're talking about how to advance human rights in the context of finance and Article 6 and just transition. And we're missing something, a really key element, which is people who've been affected by climate change, environmental human rights defenders who have been killed for standing up for the environment. And your work is critical to seeking to try to address the crisis of participation in environmental processes like this one. So turning things over to you, thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I would like to start by thanking you, Benjamin, for setting up such a wonderful panel discussion with so powerful statements coming from different countries, from different perspectives, providing also inputs for further discussions when we start discussing with states on climate justice. And it was very interesting discussions that we recalled also the importance of a human rights-based approach to climate action. And as you know, as a UN Special Rapporteur on environmental defenders, Benjamin, you recall that under the Aarhus Convention, my role is to take measures to protect environmental defenders who face penalization, persecution, and harassment simply for seeking to exercise their rights to access information, to participate in decision-making, and access justice in environmental matters as guaranteed by the Aarhus Convention. And the exercise of these rights includes precisely participation in international forums relating to the environment, like the COPs. And as such, my mandate covers cases of threats of environmental defenders who participate or seek to participate in the COPs. And the reason why I'm highlighting that in my closing remarks, why I'm highlighting this component of my mandate relating to the safe participation of defenders at COP is precisely because a human-based approach, as discussed during this panel discussion, cannot be achieved without the participation of defenders themselves, as we have heard from Gina, from Mary Joyce, from Rebecca, from Reib and Janine. However, we all know for a fact that the safe participation of defenders in COPs cannot be guaranteed without a strong civic space. It cannot be guaranteed without a strong civic space. And it cannot be guaranteed even in UN-led international spaces, in countries where the right to defend human rights is perceived as a threat to public order, or where defenders are portrayed as criminals. As we have already been made aware of issues of access to this COP for environmental defenders or journalists who, for instance, express simply their solidarity with environmental defenders of Azerbaijan, it is for me essential, it is key that the international community and all UN bodies and agencies publicly stand with environmental defenders and human rights defenders as a whole in their efforts to achieve a just and transformative climate action. Daily, and with my conclusion, we must recall environmental defenders that they are not alone and that we are all with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. And just a couple of quick announcements. One is that we'd love to get a photo with all of the speakers, and including those of you sitting in the front row. So if you could give us just 1 or 2 more minutes of your time for that at the conclusion, we'd appreciate it. We do also need to clear this room quickly. There will be another event starting in 14 minutes. So I also would like just one more round of applause for our distinguished speakers and panelists. Really appreciate it. Many thanks as well to the audience, to those of you who took time out of your very busy schedules to talk about this important subject matter. On behalf of OHCHR, UNU, UN Women, all the other co-sponsors, and the UN Environment Management Group, Issue Management Group on Human Rights and Environment, I'd like to thank you all, and happy to continue this discussion, and we'll be here for the next 2 weeks fighting for and advocating for rights-based environmental action, and we hope you will be too.